Okay, welcome. Oh, make sure this, can everybody hear me on this? Welcome y bienvenidos a todos. My name is Marie Basche. I'm a member of the Committee for Diversity and Inclusion here at Capitol. My day job is to be the director of the Academic Success Center. As a proud co-sponsor of today's event, the Committee for Diversity and Inclusion would like to thank everyone for attending today's panel discussion on the implications of DACA and what this hotly contested policy means for the future of millions of young people who were brought to this country to seek a better life, some of whom are members of our own student body. The Committee for Diversity and Inclusion is a very active group with a membership consisting of representatives from across our campus community. As an official subgroup of the College Senate and with full support from our president, Dr. Wilfredo Nieves, the committee is charged with developing programs and recommending policies to expand the college's commitment to diversity and inclusion along many different definitions, including race, culture, ethnicity and national origin, gender and gender identity, ability, sexual orientation, and religion. Further, we are committed to creating opportunities for courageous conversations to take place that will enhance interactions between persons of all backgrounds and perspectives, no matter how difficult those conversations might be. CCC is indeed a racially and ethnically diverse campus with approximately 50 countries represented and a student population that ranges from high school students to active seniors. However, we also recognize that having a diverse campus is simply not enough. Embracing the values of inclusion, diversity, and social justice requires hard work and heavy lifting from all members of the college community and must be part of the daily practice of our institution. Today's important discussion on DACA is but one example of the many events that the committee organizes throughout the year, including forums on mental health, homelessness, and disabilities, celebrations such as the Taste of Culture, presentations for the Center for Teaching, faculty and staff gatherings, book discussions and lectures, and our annual Women's Conference. I would like to ask fellow members of the Committee for Diversity and Inclusion who are present today, including our chair, Professor Michelle White, and later our co-chair, Cheryl Lee, will join us, to please stand and be recognized. So members, if you're in the room, please. Okay, yeah, we got Roxanne. Marcus is over there also. I'm not sure, I don't think he's hearing me. Anyway. Okay, and with that, I'll turn things over to Edwin Colon, attorney for Children's Advocacy, directing the Immigrant Children's Justice Project, and an adjunct faculty member for the Social and Behavioral Science Department at CCC. He, along with Professor White, have generously devoted much of their time and energy to help bring this important event to our campus. Attorney Colon will be framing our discussion today and introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So a couple things. You should, first of all, welcome and thanks for joining us, taking time from your busy schedules. And sorry we're a little bit of the delay. We want to make sure that you all have a blue card that was given to you at the beginning. In that card, there are two things that we would be interested in hearing from you. First, sort of your impressions about the program today. And then if you have any questions, the way we're going to moderate questions at the end is that we're asking you to please write in your questions, and we'll be collecting them shortly towards the end of the program today. And then we'll moderate those questions. So I will very quickly introduce our panel, and I want to thank them for, again, taking time of their busy schedule to be here. And I'm going to start from left to right. Ms. Dania Perez, a really amazing third-year law student at Quinnipiac Law School, and Mr. Noel Watson, who is an activist here in Hartford, Mr. Varun Khattar, also an activist and social organizer in Hartford, and Dr. Mark Overmeyer Velasquez, who is the director of the UConn Hartford campus, and my dear colleague, Professor Rochelle White. So I just want to frame the way in which this is going to happen. I just want to talk briefly about what DACA was and the legal elements of DACA. But before I do that, I want to also say this is a safe space for people, and that we, as a campus that deals with academia, we want to have a safe discourse. We can disagree on issues, but we ask that people are respectful of one another as we're having this discussion. And so the first thing is, what was DACA, right? So, I can't memorize this, right? So I'm going to read it. DACA was a program that ended by the Trump administration on September 5th, 2017. And it was enacted by President Obama in June of 2012. And so the program is something called, or was enacted under something called prosecutorial discretion. So the best way to describe this is, if you get a traffic ticket, right, you get the option of paying the traffic ticket or contest it. If you contest a traffic ticket, you usually have to show up to court, talk to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor can determine whether or not to use the resources available to the courts to prosecute the ticket or dismiss it, right? So that is called prosecutorial discretion. Whether as an agency or court, I'm going to use the resources I have available to me to prosecute certain cases. Prosecutorial discretion has been available and used in the Immigration and Nationality Act since the 19th century. So there's precedent there since 1825 to use prosecutorial discretion as a way to defer action on certain cases. The way our immigration laws are enacted, the way the current Immigration and Nationality Act is from 1952. It has been amended several times. But the basic concept about the Immigration and Nationality Act, it's really based on categories of people who are deemed or vetted as desirable people to enter the country, who gets to come in. That's really what the Immigration and Nationality Act is about. And then it forecloses other people from entering the country. And why is that important? Because we hear a lot of discourse around people need to get in line, or people have to go through the legal way to enter the country. Well, that legal way or that line really does not exist. It leaves millions of people out of the ability to regularize their status. And so, backdrop to the activism and social organizing that led to the DACA program. So first of all, there were many efforts early in 2000 to pass a DREAM Act, which originally was designed to provide relief for children who have been brought to the country by their parents at a very young age, and by all intents and purposes had grown up in the country, right? That act failed in 2004. It was reintroduced in 2010 after the Obama election, and it almost passed. It was shy of 3 votes, I believe, of getting passed, and unfortunately it failed again. So in 2012, President Obama enacted under prosecutorial discretion, which is a legal relief. It has precedent, right, to do this under federal law, a program that said essentially, if you were under the age of 31 as of June 15, 2012, if you came to the US before reaching your 16th birthday, if you had continuously resided in the US since June 15, 2007, up until that time, June 15, 2012, and you were physically present in the US on June 15, 2012, and at the time of making your request for consideration of deferred action with the federal administrative agency that deals with the immigration benefit, and had no lawful status, had completed a GED, or were honorably discharged from the armed forces, had not been convicted of a felony, a significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more misdemeanors. So you can see the list is very extensive, And these are all requirements, right? If you did not meet one requirement, you could not get defer action. And what did defer action actually do? It provided essentially three important things. One, it provided people the promise from the government that they will not be prosecuted for a period of 2 years. Essentially, that the government will not use their resources to remove them from the country. The second thing that it did is it allowed people to get an employment authorization document. It allowed them to work lawfully in the United States for a period of 2 years. The third thing that it did that's really important is that, without getting too technical here, right, but under the Immigration and Nationality Act, there are these things called mandatory bars. And essentially what these things are is if you enter the country without status, after certain periods of time, you accrue these mandatory bars. Some of them, one, there's a 3-year mandatory bar, there's a 10-year mandatory bar. And what these mandatory bars essentially mean is, even if you are able to attain a way to regularize your status at some point, those mandatory bars prevent you from regularizing your status for a period of 10 years or 3 years. So let's say, for example, I enter the country pursuant to a fiancé visa, right? Someone petitioned for me to enter the country. And I get 90 days to get married. I don't get married. Instead, the relationship ends. I overstay that visa. So I'm now without status. After 3 months of staying without status, I accrue a 3-year mandatory bar. So down the road, that same person says, I want to marry you now. I changed my mind. I think you're wonderful, right? I cannot get that benefit for a period of 3 years. I have to leave the country for 3 years. So for people who are DACA recipients, it stopped that period of accruing what is called unlawful presence. Okay, so those are the three important things. In 2015, there were also efforts, again, to reintroduce DREAM Act. Didn't go through. 2015, President Obama announced the defer action for parents of arrivals, which would have provided a similar relief under DACA for parents of U.S. citizen children or children who had DACA status. Unfortunately, that did not come to fruition. Texas, along with other 25 state attorney generals, sued the federal government to stop them from progressing with the DACA program. And essentially their argument was that if DACA would have been implemented, that the states would have been harmed because they would have had, for example, Texas' argument was, if we have to implement this program, we would have to provide driver's licenses for DACA recipients. And that would be a cost to the state. That was their argument, right? That argument reached the Supreme Court, and this is June 2016. Justice Scalia had just passed, and it was an even split decision. So it stayed. The decision from a lower court stayed. Fast forward, we have President Trump come into office, and you heard a lot of the flip-flop that happened around DACA. And the last, I think, statement that he had made early in the summer, some point in the summer, was that he was not going to rescind DACA. And then 10 state attorney generals, again led by Texas, threatened the Trump administration with legal action that will challenge DACA in court if he did not rescind the program by September 5th of this year. So he did. He rescinded the program on September 5th and allowed basically a very, very short period of time, a month, for people to renew their DACA if their DACA expired between September 5th, 2017 and March 5th, 2018. So that's sort of the framework going into the discussion. And we're going to now start. And actually, yes, Wilfredo's here, so Wilfredo, want to make a few remarks?
Certainly, one, I want to thank our panelists, our speakers, because this, for us here at Capitol, is a very, very important matter. We see ourselves as an institution that lives and breathes DACA. diversity, and inclusiveness. And we want to make sure that our students and others who may fall under this category, the DACA category, or others that are raising concerns, have the opportunity to continue their studies or to begin their studies. For me, it's a very personal issue because I really believe and I think about why do people come to the United States. And it is for opportunities, for the avenues that have been presented historically, and unfortunately we find ourselves at a time where we're not acting in the way I think we want to see others act as Americans, where we welcome and we want others to be part of our society. So for me, the opportunity to hear from individuals who are experiencing, people who have certainly a good understanding of the law and the rights that people have, so that we can confront the situation in a unified way and certainly support individuals who are experiencing the difficulties that they are. So my colleagues, certainly individuals who, that I can't thank you enough on behalf of our faculty, staff, and students. So you're the ones who we're looking to give us good information so we can be knowledgeable and helpful to the individuals who want to be part of our community. Thank you.
Thank you. There's microphones right there. Okay, so we're going to get started, and Professor White is, we're trying to make this a little more casual. So this is what we're in this circle. And I forgot to mention, we have another panelist who's running a little late. She's coming from Bridgeport, Barbara Lopez from Make the Road.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Right? I won't say it in any other language. I'm just constrained to two. But thank you, and thank you for coming. Welcome. We have a number of questions that Edwin and myself have decided to alternate in posing for the panelists. And as Professor Edwin Colon had mentioned earlier, if you have any questions from the audience, you received at the point of registration, you received a form that you could use the back of the evaluation form to pose those questions. The members of the Committee for Diversity and Inclusion will then collect your questions, and those questions hopefully will have an opportunity to pose them towards the end of the panel presentation. So we flipped coins similar to what they do in the Super Bowl, right? And I won the coin flip. Thank you. So I will start with the first question. It's just open to any of the members of the panel. Tell us about your experience around immigration, and also what type of work are you doing now?
I can start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dania Perez, and I'm a third-year law student at Quinnipiac. And I am undocumented. I have DACA. I was born in Mexico when my parents and I came to the US when I was 11 months old. So I guess my experience around immigration is that I am an immigrant. I'm undocumented. My parents were in deportation proceedings for a really long time. And that was partly what inspired me to want to get a law degree, because it was really hard. I'm the oldest of four. My brothers were born here, but I'm the eldest, and I would have to translate a lot for my parents. And obviously, at like 8, 10 years old, I didn't know what was going on, but I had to try to help my parents figure it out. And it was really hard to not be able to do more. So I went to school, and I'm at Quinnipiac now, and all my experience has been around immigration law. I want to do deportation defense and specifically help people with criminal convictions, because it's really hard for people who have any sort of record to get an attorney, and I think those are the people who are most at risk of deportation, especially under the Trump administration. So my experience with immigration is that I am an immigrant. I'm undocumented. unafraid, unashamed, and I want to help other people like myself and my parents.
My name is Noel Watson. I'm an activist in Hartford, and my experience with immigration was that I am an immigrant. I was born in Jamaica, and I came here when I was 8 years old. I'm the oldest of 3 brothers, and growing up, we weren't really aware of the situation because my parents kept it behind closed doors out of fear that we might be scared. And as I got older, I learned more. And in terms of trying to make a difference in the community, a lot of people who are in my position don't understand that there is a way to not feel scared and go out there and try to make a difference. And that's what me and my fellow friends here are trying to do, is just show people that there is a way to, get out of the quote-unquote rat race.
Hi, y'all. My name is Varun, Khattar. I'm a community organizer with the Connecticut Center for a New Economy. So I organize youth for racial equity in our public schools here in Hartford. So that's a separate panel discussion that I would love to be a part of. But my connection to the issue of immigration, I don't know if I'm holding this too close, or I was born down the street. I was born in Hartford Hospital. My parents immigrated here in the late 80s from India. My dad came here on had the privilege of coming here on a work visa. And my mom was here as a tourist and got married to my dad to get a green card, and here I am. And my family go back through generations of migration. My parents, originally my family was displaced from Pakistan when the country split after getting its independence from the British Empire, but this is an issue I, growing up, didn't really think much about. I grew up in South Windsor, with attending predominantly white schools, struggled to assimilate, but really didn't think about what a privilege it was for me to have my papers, to be able to work, to be able to access scholarships. And not live in fear of deportation. So it wasn't until my junior year of college, that I took a class with Professor Overmeyer Velasquez, and really began to learn more about this issue. Got involved through a service learning project in Connecticut Students for a Dream. This is back in 2015, I believe, 2014, maybe fall of 2014. And it's sort of the rest is history. I've been involved in Hartford in our organizing with undocumented youth and allies to pass policies and laws that increase access to higher education for undocumented immigrants. And I worked, after graduating from college, I worked in public schools as a bilingual tutor, working with new arrivals in the classroom, majority of whom did not qualify for DACA, majority of whom were unaccompanied minors from Central America. And so that became really a passion of mine, working with that population. And then post-election, a few of us neighbors in Hartford, so I currently live in Hartford, and a group of us neighbors came together to form a local deportation defense team. So we've been working for the past, now probably 10, 11 months on supporting local immigrant families, organizing with immigrant families. So we created a hotline, did work, providing accompaniment to immigrants going to court and ICE check-ins, doing legal clinics. We started a legal assistance fund. We've raised a few $1,000s to help support, pay legal fees for immigrants in deportation proceedings. And so I continue to stay involved with that work. And also I'm organizing in Hartford for racial equity in our schools. So we know we will not have racial equity without addressing the issue of immigration, without and if our schools are not safe for undocumented students and families, then we don't have racial equity. So it's really, and the youth I organize with include undocumented youth, some who are here at Capitol. And so I'm excited to be here. non-expert. I'm just excited to learn from the other panelists, and yeah, thank you for having me.
Hello, good afternoon, buenas tardes. I'm Marco Overmyer Velasquez. First of all, thanks to President Nieves, to Edwin, to Michelle, to Marie Basche, to Capital Community College. For me, I just started down the street at UConn Hartford, and it's so exciting to be neighbors and colleagues with all y'all. This is a really powerful, exciting institution that brings together the community and does these kinds of events, so I'm really appreciative of that. I'm also appreciative of my fellow panelists here. One thing I've learned very quickly as a professor and someone who has papers, is documented, and has gone through the immigration experience in different ways, is that the most learning that I can do and the most hope that I have for the future comes from folks like these folks up here and others in the audience I know and my students. It's a very powerful reminder of what I need to do as, I guess, becoming kind of an elder in this movement, and to really look to you all for your courageous work and appreciate that. So I grew up, I was born in Chicago to a mother from Mexico and a father from Ohio. My mother came to the US in 1950 before a lot of kind of major formative late 20th century immigration legislation, and moved with her family, emigrated to Chicago. And then I, with my family, emigrated to Canada. So I grew up in Canada as a landed immigrant. And then I came back to the US in the 90s. And as I like to say, I became Latino in 1996, because in Canada, this sort of category doesn't make sense, and we can talk about the history of racial making. And then, so that's part of my identity is firmly rooted in Mexican communities, Mexican-American communities, and family in Mexico. My own experience growing up in Canada, which, despite other opinions, is a different country than the United States and has different attitudes about immigration. And then I became an academic, an educator, and I've been teaching at University of Connecticut for about 13 years now. Was the director of the Institute for Latino and Latin American Studies, and had the opportunity to work with amazing students like Varun around issues of immigration. And so my scholarship and teaching has been about, more recently, about immigration from Mexico, Latinos, and people from Latin America immigrating around the world. And then more recently, I kind of came back to my community activist roots prior to graduate school, and have been doing work with my colleague Edwin Colon and others here. I see Camille here, from Connecticut Students for a Dream, and was part of the founding board of directors for Connecticut Students for a Dream, which I'm sure is an organization that many of you know, and if you don't, you'll learn more about today. And I guess today, now that I'm back here in Hartford, and my work at UConn Hartford, it really is a continuation of that, really an opportunity to work with what is a majority first generation, mainly Black, Latino, and largely Muslim population at UConn Hartford, to be an advocate for this kind of work. Because in addition to the context that you provided, I think fundamental, even kind of larger context with immigration is that these questions that we're asking today are fundamental to who we are as American, fundamental to the kind of sense of identity of being or not being an American. So all of this conversation about DACA, about immigration reform, about belonging, citizenship or not citizenship, documented status, really fundamentally gets at a question of, kind of a racialized notion of who we are as Americans. And so we can talk about the specifics of different dates and different policy measures, but all of it, I don't think we should lose sight of a larger issue of this kind of notion of democracy and belonging in this country, which is both a deep wound and a deep possibility for all of us to deal with.
So thank you, everyone. I think I'm going to combine two questions here, right? Which is actually, as a lawyer, this is a bad use of form of the question, right, Denia? So the first really has to do with if you can speak to how life has changed. Can people hear me? Okay. How life has changed for you. If you were a DACA recipient, how did life change for you as a result of receiving DACA? And then, as a result of the rescission, what is the change after the rescission?
For me personally, when I got out there and realized that I was undocumented, certain things that I've been looking forward to, like getting a license and working a regular job, it became known to me that I wasn't able to do those things. Hello? Okay. As I got older and realized that I was undocumented, there were certain things that I was looking forward to growing up, like getting my license and working a regular job, applying for student loans, just normal things. And it wasn't until after I realized that I couldn't do it, after receiving DACA, my employment authorization card, and I was able to apply for all of these things, that was the major difference for me, is the fact that I was able to do things that a lot of people consider normal. And after the rescission, it was hard because I have family members that I told about it, and they were all looking forward to applying for it, saving up the money that was needed, and getting what they need, and now they can't. And that's the biggest problem in my opinion.
So similar to Noel, I think that DACA for me just opened up a lot of doors that were previously closed. So getting a driver's license. So I grew up in California, so I'm not from here. And in California, I remember when I turned 16, I went to the DMV. I knew that I was undocumented, but I was like, I'm just gonna try anyway. Like the worst thing that can happen is they're gonna say no. So that was just my mindset. It was, I'm just gonna go and see what happens. And it was awful. They were really rude, and I presented my Mexican birth certificate, and they're like, where's your visa? And I was like, I don't have one. They're like, you can't apply for a license. So that was really hard, and I also wasn't able to get financial aid for school, so that made going to school really hard. And when I got DACA, it was just really liberating because I felt like, oh, at 21, I can finally apply to get a driver's license and just do everything that my peers were able to do at a much younger age. I was like, okay, cool, I finally have permission to be an adult and pay taxes and get a social security number and get a driver's license. So the biggest thing that's changed, I guess, since the announcement of DACA, since the announcement of the rescission of DACA, is that I'm just very mindful of when my work permit is going to expire. So mine expires next October, and so that means I wasn't able to renew, because some people were able to renew their work permit if it expired in March or before March. And I'm a law student, and I'm graduating in May. So I was really excited about working and renewing my DACA so that I could go back to the community and do the work. But I guess now I'm just in a limbo where I'm not out of my DACA status yet, but if Congress doesn't get its act together and replace it with something, I'm not going to be able to use my law degree the way I want to come next October, and I'm not going to be able to work legally. So I think I'm just very aware of all of the things and opportunities that are going to go away if DACA doesn't get replaced. And I have a lot of friends in similar situations who have health care because they have DACA and they're going to lose that, and who have jobs that they're going to lose because their work permits are going to expire. So it's just a loss of a lot of things that a lot of people take for granted.
Thank you, Dania. The next two questions, similar to Edwin, will be a bit of a double barrel question. The first one is in terms of the economic impact that DACA has in this country. And again, any of the panelists could answer that. And then what are some of the risks for DACA recipients now in today's age and date?
I'll get to the question of economic impact. And there's another question here about the assertion that Sessions made about DACA jobs taking away. Can I address that as well? I don't want to jump ahead anyway. So the question there is, what do you think about the assertion made by some that DACA recipients take away jobs from Americans? So I have to take a breath when I talk about this because I get really angry about this whole logic, because part of the reason we're here and that there's such a precarious situation for Noel and Denny and other people is not new, right? The history of immigrants in this country has long since been one of a precarious, vulnerable situation. And we have certain kinds of immigration legislation that enables this kind of vulnerability to persist, because it means people can be paid less, they get less rights, they have less access, and it creates and adds to a long list of, in its less violent form, kind of casual labor to the most extreme forms of slavery and how we've treated other people vis-a-vis race and labor. So all of this is part of that long history, and here we are at today's manifestation of that longer history that we need to contend with. So that's kind of the broad historical overview. So let's talk about numbers, right? So there was an assertion, and part of the logic is, how does the Trump administration and Jeff Sessions, in particular as Attorney General, make an argument for the undoing of the Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals, of DACA, in September? And there were two main points. One is that there's DACA recipients, harm the economy. And the other one is that, there was a number of ones, but we'll get to the second one later. But anyway, this one was economic driver, which is, an important thing to consider, because people want to make sure we're an economically viable country, and at the same time want to be a country that, in theory, is welcoming to immigrants. So the assertion is that there was an economic impact, that DACA recipients were indeed taking away jobs. So I've done, in my research, and I've done a lot of work and reading about these kinds of things, in particular the economic impacts. And we know from even our most conservative economists that immigrants ultimately bring money and contribute to the economy. So the bottom line up front is that Sessions is wrong, right? That this notion that DACA recipients are harming the economy is actually the inversion of the truth. What DACA, imagine these fine individuals here and the intelligence and the capacity that they have to bring to the labor force, and the kinds of ancillary and additional benefits that come from their labor. Just to think of you as economic units, right? Which is horrible, but it's part of that conversation. So first of all, DACA recipients are like kind of H-1B visa holders. They're advanced, they have higher education, they fill higher echelon jobs that in turn create other kind of jobs. So their economic productivity leads to more jobs. So it's not just that they are paying taxes and they're consumers because they make more money if they're allowed to work, but that they in turn will make more jobs. So the notion that we have X number of jobs that get filled, and if they're taken by other people won't get them, is also false, right? New populations, increased populations, especially people with capacity to create more jobs, are beneficial to the economy in general. And a fine point on it, a recent study that I read in the Hartford Business Journal, which is not necessarily a kind of radical, progressive Marxist newspaper, magazine, which mentioned that immigrants in Connecticut immigrants generally, $1.2 billion in business revenue in 2014, represent over 17% of the state's labor force, and contributed $3.3 billion in federal taxes, another close to $2 billion in local and state taxes, and spent close to $14 billion to bolster the state economy. So those are raw numbers. We know that the number of undocumented individuals, it's very hard to measure because people aren't necessarily registering, but our best number is that there's about 105,000 so-called unauthorized folk here in Connecticut, or about 3% of our population. And of that, the best numbers out of the Migration Policy Institute show that the unauthorized, undocumented population constitutes over 5% of the workforce and contributes $135 million to state and local taxes. So there's some direct, concrete, measurable benefits from immigrants in general, and then also specifically from our undocumented population. So just that is just a kind of as a primer, a way of thinking about economy and immigrants as well. What else? Yeah, I mean, the other thing is our economy in general is on the upswing, and so there are jobs to be had, and we need more workers as well. So to answer the question, in other words, if DACA recipients are removed from the labor pool, it's going to harm us. It's going to harm the country. It's going to harm our state, in addition to all of the other social, political, cultural, emotional impacts that it'll cause as well.
Thank you.
And if I could just quickly add something to that, I think, I think this is a hard question to respond to, I think, because I think, and I can't speak for everyone here, but I think a lot of us think in terms of, like, from a rights framework. And so, the notion that, immigrants deserve, safety, opportunity, because they are like, are a source of generate wealth or generate like economic productivity for our country is something I struggle. I just have a hard time with that. I think access to healthcare should be universal. I think access to education should be universal. I think that families should not be separated. I think so. I think that there's a lot of the conversation gets framed in terms of both on the left and the right that there's DACA recipients are, they're high-achieving students, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're engineers, and I think those things are all true. And I think that we're kind of missing the point if we only focus on the numbers and not focus on on the human lives, right, at stake. And also, I think what I would and Mark mentioned this. I can call you Mark now. Mark mentioned this. That and put it in simpler terms, right? The U.S. economy was built on slavery, genocide, like land theft, exploitation of immigrant labor. We know, like, historically, the U.S. has deported, right, U.S. citizens to Mexico, so during times of war, when there was a need for a labor force, they'll, grant, visas to, Mexicans to come to the U.S., and then as soon as, people return from war, there was, mass deportations of people who were born here who had citizenship, right? We know as soon as, there was this notion that Asians were taking jobs, right, from Europeans, right, European Americans. So there were laws passed to ban immigration from Asia, right? So for decades until 1965, right, it was essentially you couldn't migrate from Asia, and that's because of this logic that our number one priority is protecting our economy, right? We're recognizing that that logic is racialized, and that's like academic jargon. But I think the fact is, I think that I don't know. I think that let's have this. Let's talk about the economic impact of DACA and immigration, but let's not stop there. And we're not going to stop there. But I think that, and I guess to bring it back to, I like to think in terms of stories. I think numbers and theories sometimes, can be kind of, up here, and I like to think in terms of stories, and I think about, one of my students I worked with as a bilingual tutor at East Hartford High School, who, came from Honduras, and he, didn't have DACA, came here a few years ago, never had attended school before in his life, worked on a farm, came here, couldn't read or write, was working really 60 hours a week, working under the table, a low-wage job, no benefits, right? And and coming to school every day with, and not to like romanticize, right, this, but like, was one of the most, kind of, was always a big smile on his face, right? And I think, and I just think about, and I just think that these are the type of people that our government is criminalizing and saying we should deport. A 16-year-old he worked more hours than I did, and making less, and continued to go to school. And was he posing a threat to anyone? Was he a threat to our economy? I would argue no, right? So I think that's, I guess, how I think about it.
To segue from the economic implication, if the other two panelists could address the risk. What are some of the risks to DACA recipients now?
The risk personally, or?
Yes.
Okay. Well, amongst the people that I speak with, the general consensus is that since the government has a lot of our information now, once DACA is over, there's a fear of deportation just because they know where we are, what we're doing, and who we're with. So that's, in my opinion, the answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the risk of deportation under the new Trump administration. There are no priorities. Everyone and anyone who's undocumented is subject to deportation. Obama, I have a love-hate relationship with. I think he's great, but he deported 2 million people. But under his administration, there were different categories and priorities, and he really encouraged ICE, or Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which is in charge of deporting people, to really use their discretion and their resources so that they're not deporting, moms and dads who have kids, who don't have a criminal record, who are just working. He encouraged them to be smart about when and where they decide to use their power, but under Trump, it doesn't matter. They're deporting grandmas, they're deporting dads, they're deporting people in hospitals. It's just really unfortunate that now, because of this fear of people who are different, people who are brown, that the government is essentially targeting everyone, whether or not they actually pose a threat.
Thank you. Just a reminder to the audience that you have the opportunity to write your questions. There's a blue form that has gone around during registration, and members of the Committee for Diversity and Inclusion will be going around to collect those. Attorney Colon.
Yeah, so I think that the next question, it's a little segue, maybe in something that I think Varun touched on. And one of the things that Sessions also argued was that the influx of unaccompanied minors, primarily from the Triangle Peninsula, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, that the reason they were coming here was because DACA existed and it gave them a false illusion. So how would you, counter that argument?
I want to know where Jeff Sessions went to law school, because his logic is extremely faulty. I have a few choice words for him, but I will refrain. I think anyone who really knows their history, and by their history I mean US history, knows that the influx of unaccompanied minors did not just happen overnight. The US has a history of meddling in other people's business, for better or for worse. And in the 80s, the US was meddling in Central America because they were afraid of the rise of communism and socialism. So the US gave a ton of money to the governments who wanted to keep communism at bay, to fight these guerrilla groups. And all of those weapons stayed in Central America. And so the rise of all of these gangs and the gang violence that has pushed a lot of people to flee from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, is a direct result of the US's involvement in their political affairs there. And so for him to say that all of these young people fleeing violence, fleeing rape, fleeing these civil wars is a direct result of DACA is completely absurd. Like Edwin said, you have to have arrived in the US before you were 16, before 2007. A lot of these kids arrived way after DACA was announced, so they wouldn't have met the requirements. Those kids are fleeing violence, and they're fleeing violence that this country helped create. So for him to say that this policy encouraged people to come here is completely false. It's an alternative fact, to use their word, and people should really honestly learn their history and ask harder questions of the US government, because I think that's the problem, is that people don't know their own history and they just assume people come to the US because they want to. A lot of times people don't have a choice.
Yeah, I think the official term is crazy town. Exactly what Dania said. I mean, two other things I'll just mention. One, I think it's consistent that his sessions, if people saw that press conference, which was kind of horrific for a lot of reasons, but one in particular, that the attempt there was to kind of subvert a humanitarian discourse, an attempt to take the language of human rights, fuse it with politics of fear that the Trump administration is very consistently sowing since January around deportation, around executive actions to anti-Muslim executive actions and these kinds of things. So Sessions used the term of anti-humanitarianism, this kind of notion that these kids were coming and creating this crisis and trying to blame it on DACA. Again, no correlation, there's no connection there. Maybe people in Central America had heard of DACA and they thought and misunderstood it as a kind of amnesty, but it's very thin and doesn't really have any direct correlation. But again, the politics of fear and creating actual structures of fear because of the real deportation, I think, is part of that story.
Thank you, Mark. Go ahead.
And if folks encourage folks, and this is a film we watched in Mark's class, but everyone please read or watch the film Harvest of Empire. It really, I think, and Mark, I don't know if you would still recommend the film, but I think it really outlines the ways in which U.S. Foreign policy shaped the economic, social, and political conditions that forced migration from Latin America to the U.S., and the ways in which and it really looks at how, right, despite all these things that we created these conditions. You look at the era when there is mass genocide of indigenous people in Central America, and the U.S. is and we like to think that the U.S. is this very humanitarian force for good in the Western Hemisphere, right? And we provide all this aid, and we allow so many refugees to enter the country. Only about 1 or 2% of people who applied applied for refugee status to come to the U.S. during the height of the genocide, when we knew what was happening, and we turned our backs, right? And so, anyways, I really recommend folks please check out that film. There's just so many more materials to look into, but I think that's a really great one. And if you're a teacher, show it in your classroom. Share it with your friends, and I'm the kind of person on a Friday night will ask my roommate to sit down and watch the film with me. But I don't know but I think it's just important to get this information out there, because there's so much lies in our curriculum and in our media that uphold the current system. And so we need to, that's part of the work that we can all do is by spreading this, not keeping this conversation here. So I'm getting a little bit carried away, but.
I think we'll get back to this towards the end of the questions, but it's at this moment in the 80s that the sanctuary movement really takes off, right? The sanctuary movement in the 1980s, driven by mainly church and other activists in this country, created this possibility that we've now since taken up in Connecticut and other places. Maybe we can talk about that as potential answers.
Thank you. And as I'm looking over towards Marie, because that was one of the movies, the videos, the documentary that CDI was able to show on our campus a couple semesters ago, but perhaps to bring it back, right? With my next question being, do you agree with some of the DACA advocates who say that the DACA fix should be a standalone legislative fix.
Yes. And just to provide context, so what a lot of activists are demanding is that Congress passed a clean dream bill or a standalone bill, which essentially means that we just want them to pass the DREAM Act without asking for more money for border enforcement, without making any concessions about people getting deported and putting more agents on the border. So historically, whenever the immigrants' rights movement tries to get something positive, anti-immigrants usually try to attach more enforcement and deportations to that. And a lot of young people, like myself, are tired of being used as a bargaining chip and being used to be pit against people like our parents and family members who don't qualify for DACA. I am a law student, I'm in the dreamer category. I roll my eyes because I don't really like that term because yes, I've worked really hard, yes, I'm smart, but just because I have an education and I've had these opportunities, it doesn't make me any more valuable or smart or worthy of the opportunity to be here. And I get really frustrated because I'm the first person in my family to go to college. My dad graduated from high school, my mom only got a 6th grade education, but they're the smartest people I know. They learned a new language, they assimilated to a new culture, and I still ask my parents for advice because I really respect what they know, but in our society, unless you have a degree, unless you speak a certain way, you don't get treated with dignity and respect, and I don't think that's right. And so the push for a clean DREAM Act, for a clean bill, is basically us as kids saying, yeah, our parents brought us here, we didn't have a say, but don't punish them for giving us a better life. They work hard like we do. They also deserve a chance, and we don't want to be separated from them. And so we absolutely want a standalone bill.
Thank you.
So anyone else wants to chime in? No? So I guess we're getting to the end of our questions, and then we're going to open up to the group for questions. So maybe to piggyback on something that Danielle was talking about is there a sense of guilt from people who were recipients of DACA, and now there's a lot of conversation about a bill and there's about 5 different bills right now in Congress, and maybe someone want to talk about what those are and the distinction, but some guilt about any relief that's provided through any of this action by Congress that also impacts negatively on those who can't get relief under the bill, right? So if anyone can speak to that in terms of if there's any, conflicted, feelings around the relief that it's being offered, but contingent on increased enforcement and other pieces to that. So the question is, in terms of people feeling conflicted around any relief effort or any relief that Congress gives to former DACA recipients at the expense of increased enforcement, what is sort of the sense in the community? If people feel guilty around, getting any protection, if it's going to cost some harm to their relatives. Can you hear me? No.
Can you repeat? Oh. I think, so there's always guilt and shame, but I think the community is really coming around, understanding that an attack on one is an attack on all. And I think families understand that they need to work together, and I think they're trying to figure out how DACA recipients do something for themselves, but they also lay a foundation for their families and folks that are coming behind them. So there's sense of anxiety and concern, but how do there's an opportunity of work together to make sure that everybody's included. So the conversation's not well, you're getting it, so I'm not showing up. The conversation's how do we make sure that we make it as broad as possible? Because we all look brown and black, so it doesn't matter if you have, or you were born here, or if you have DACA or don't, you're still going to be stopped. So that's usually what the sentiment is in the community, at least in Bridgeport where I work.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of conversations with my peers who have DACA about this, and I think that now we're all mostly on the same page about not wanting to pass anything that's gonna impact our parents negatively. And I think it's hard because the younger generation who grew up not knowing anything but DACA and doesn't remember all the failed DREAM Act. So I'm 27, which I know is not that old, but like in DREAM Act and Dreamer years, like I've been around since like the first bill was introduced. So I've seen it die and be reintroduced, and was living life without DACA longer than I have had DACA. So I'm at a point where I'm just like, we can't throw our parents and family members under the bus. But there's been a lot of conversations within the movement to educate the younger generation and to try to get on the same page about not using this narrative of blaming our parents and saying like our parents were the original ones. They're the original dreamers. They brought us here. They shouldn't be punished for wanting to give us a better life. And I know that if a DREAM Act gets passed, which I don't have a lot of hope, honestly. If it does get passed and there's more border enforcement, I think that I'm gonna obviously benefit from it, but I will work within the movement and with other people to try to like undo as much as we can those really harmful policies, because I think that we don't see it here in the Northeast, and even in Northern California where I'm from, you don't see the fear that people who live on the border. You don't see the devastating impact it has on the environment and on families to have a literal wall in between the place where you live and like your next door neighbor. And so I really feel like the people who are gonna be most affected are the people living in border towns, and their voices should be the ones really dictating how we move forward with advocacy, because they're gonna be the most directly impacted.
Anyone else wants to? I'll borrow your microphone. So this is the last question from the list of questions we had, and then we're going to open up to questions from the audience. But I actually also want to give Barbara a chance to talk about Make the Road, because everyone had a chance to talk about the work that you do. So I'll have you maybe after this question sort of explain a little bit of what you guys do. So the last question really is around, so looking ahead, what are the things that you will ask people here in this room to pay attention to support on behalf of the immigrant community in general? What are kind of the things that you want people to take away and go back to their communities and support the immigrant community at this point?
I guess 3 things in like very lawyerly fashion. So one thing I would encourage everyone to do is just have conversations with people about immigration. One of the things that really frustrates me is that immigration law is very complicated. Even immigration attorneys stumble through it. There's just a lot of different things that make it really difficult to master. But even though it's really complicated, everyone seems to have a strong opinion one way or the other. And that is really frustrating, because I'm the type of person where if I don't know enough about something, I'm not gonna have an opinion about it, because I wanna educate myself and learn more. But for some reason, when it comes to immigration, everyone just assumes a lot of things and then takes a position. People are just like, oh, we'll just get in line, or like, why don't they do things the right way, instead of thinking about, well, what's wrong with the system that 11 million people can't get in line? Like, what is wrong with this line that like 11 million people aren't able to get through it? So one thing is to just like ask questions and have conversations with yourself and with family members about immigration. Like, do you know what it takes to be a citizen? Do you know how long it takes? Do you know how much it costs? If the answer to all those things is no, the Migration Policy Institute has great resources, Immigration Legal Resource Center, like there's just so much out there, so much good information to help educate yourself. So thing 2 that I would ask people to do is to call your congresspeople and senators and encourage them to pass a clean DREAM Act bill. And so like I said, a clean DREAM Act bill would essentially just be the DREAM Act without any further enforcement or money for this stupid wall. You are taxpayers. You don't want billions of your tax dollars going to build a wall when that money can be used on hurricane relief efforts, can be used to help fix the potholes in the road, can be used for schools. Why are we wasting money building this wall that is not gonna get to the root of the problem? So as citizens, for those of you who can vote, call up your congresspeople, get involved and encourage them to pass a Clean DREAM Act bill. And the third thing I would encourage people to do, if they aren't already involved, is to get involved with a local immigrants' rights organization or call up a legal services organization and see if they need volunteers for a clinic or a workshop that they're doing. I think that right now there's a lot of opportunities to get educated and to meet people. If you don't know an undocumented person, this would be a great way to maybe whatever fears or biases you have to really confront those and put a human face to the issue. Because a lot of times I think that's the problem, is like we just read the news or hear these stories and we're like, oh God, rapists, criminals, drug dealers. But if you don't meet someone and you don't hear their story, then we're always gonna be this boogeyman. But we're just normal people and we have a story to share. So I'd encourage you to meet people and get outside of your comfort zone and really talk to someone who has tried to get their documents and can't, or has left their country for one reason or another.
So I would just say, to add to that, I agree, and especially to the last point, please follow Connecticut Students for a Dream on social media. Follow the Connecticut Immigrant Rights Alliance, which is a coalition of immigrant rights organizations in Connecticut that come together to work on advocacy campaigns, to support deportation defense cases, to share resources. So please, that's one way to stay informed. I'm gonna be here if folks want to give their email and phone number to be contacted about, be added to a listserv where you'll receive email updates about actions going on. So we have one tomorrow. Is today Thursday or today's Wednesday? Wednesday. So on Friday morning at 7:30 a.m., there'll be an action in front of the federal court building in support of a friend of ours who's been a long time activist in the immigrant community here in Connecticut. Mariano, his father's again facing deportation. And so I invite you to please, join us. Show, it's one thing to, let's educate ourselves and then let's take action. Let's put our, especially if we have the privilege to go out there and take a rest at a protest. But not even if you don't have to take a rest, just be there. Be visible And I would also encourage folks, if you're interested in there's ways you can donate. We have a local legal assistance fund that provides, pays legal fees for immigrants facing deportation. So if you're able to, please contribute to that. There's the Connecticut Bail Fund, which is a statewide fund specifically to cover bail for immigrants in deportation proceedings. And so, I would just talk to one of us. Again, I live here in Hartford, and we have our local group. It's a group of mostly immigrant mothers that come together about once every 2 weeks, and we have planned events, community events. Again, we've done work to not just educate people, but also to support families in need, in crisis. And so there's a lot of ways to get involved. But just start by again, let's connect and let's build together.
Here we go. All right. So a couple other points in addition to these really brilliant ones is, absent federal policies, comprehensive immigration policies, what we've seen that has been most effective are local and statewide impacts. In Connecticut, we're still holding on to some relatively progressive immigration rights agendas vis-a-vis tuition and driver's license and some other things. So doing stuff in your local communities, helping to change local city and town ordinance around, whether it's a sanctuary policy or access and support for immigrant families in your own communities is really powerful, raising money, et cetera, like that, also on the state level. And also to be, understand there's a lot of different ways to be an activist. There's a lot of different ways. There's giving money, there's writing letters, there's being engaged in actions, but also, I think to our earlier conversation, like being able to speak about economic policies is also, is the language some people will understand, that that immigrants, undocumented immigrants, contribute to the local economy. That will help engage other kinds of people that maybe a rights-based dialogue won't. Sort of thinking about that as well.
And I also apologize. So, like Edwin said, I'm going to make the road. We are based out of Bridgeport. We're an immigrant rights organization, so we advocate for and fight for rights around education, workers' rights, immigration. So we had a big victory back in May. We passed a sanctuary city resolution locally, and we're working on an ordinance to make it enforceable. But I think back to your question, Edwin, I think just show up to different spaces. The folks that we work with are incredibly, like mothers, youth, workers, friends, neighbors, are incredibly accessible, and they always want to learn, and they always need backup, right? They always need someone to go with them to fill out an application, to enroll their kids to school, or get a municipal ID, or go to the DMV, or sometimes they're just really scared. They get stopped by for whatever reason, and this all fear comes into their mentality that something they did, and they don't realize there's a system behind it. So we always need folks to be in our spaces to just provide emotional support, because there's just so much going on, and they're fighters. They're fighting every day. They get up and fight. So I think just showing up, because you might feel that you have nothing to offer, but you have a lot to offer. So I think just show up.
Thank you, Barbara. I think maybe this question you can start to answer. So it's actually around sanctuary cities, and so explain the policy around sanctuary cities and the ability of churches and other places to provide safe haven for people who are pending deportation. So I don't know. I'm sort of putting you on the spot, but anyone can take that on if they choose to.
It just came from.
So the question is around sanctuary cities and the policy regarding sanctuary cities, but I think it's more directed towards the people taking refuge or sanctuary in churches pending deportation, and if someone can explain what is, what actually yields or shields people from having ICE come into the church and pick them up.
So I'll attempt to respond, and please jump in. So I think there's, so I guess what we've learned, what history has taught us, is that that there's a lot of ways we can advocate within the law, but sometimes the law itself is unjust, right? Oftentimes the law itself is unjust and requires citizens, or requires people to take action, right, beyond the law, in order to defend our communities. Right, some would argue, right, there's a higher law, there's a law of conscience that we all must abide by. So the sanctuary movement really is for folks, and I will say it's not easy to take sanctuary. It takes a major toll on a family, on a person, to uproot their whole life and move into a church, oftentimes being separated. That itself is a form of family separation. It's a brave thing to do. And I think it's in the immigration customs enforcement, right? Historically, right, has certain areas that they are sort of off limits, that so they will not enter churches. Again, and I say this recognizing that they also don't always respect the law. So, I think that in many cases they are violating the law, right? They're violating the Constitution. But historically, they do not enter schools. They claim that they will not enter hospitals, and they do not enter churches. We know that there are many cases of that not being true. But so taking sanctuary in a church is a way to, again, resist being deported once you've exhausted all other options. And it's another way to make a political statement, right? That this is, and we've seen it in cases it has worked, and actually getting people a stay, or extending their stay. And so I don't know if folks want to add to that. But.
Yeah, I think to add, the reality is folks have been getting deported for always. And I think what we've seen since summer, if I can remember correctly, I think there's been 5 sanctuary cases in Connecticut. But I think it's incredible, like you said, it's incredibly brave for VAMS to say, you know what, like we are being targeted. We've been in the US for many, many years. And it's an incredibly difficult process. Not only like we're gonna stand up and fight, but then you have to find a church that has a shower, which is like something that you would never think that you have to worry about, but you do. And then the church is incredibly political. You have to go like through like the branches of how that's gonna happen. And of course, there's a lot of like, and we're talking like in a minute, but it's like incredibly long process. Sierra took a lead on this, but there has to be various conversations and relationships built ahead of time. And the churches, I'm not religious, so the priest or who else, whoever runs the church, yeah, whoever, yeah, the folks who run the church need to understand the responsibility they take on by taking in the sanctuary individual. And then there's always like a plan in action of like, okay, this person's taking sanctuary, how do we support them? Because it takes, again, an emotional toll. But again, the loss is one thing, but if they're gonna respect is something else. So there's always like support for that individual. And it's happening across Connecticut, really. So it's, I don't know what else I could.
Say one more thing. This is another way you can get involved, is if you're interested in volunteering to support someone. I know currently I think we have 2 people in sanctuary, one in Meriden, one in New Haven. I know that's not very close to us, but that's another way. If you share your contact information and you let me know if you're interested in volunteering, and I'll share that information with you about ways to get involved in supporting those families. There's a lot of logistics of being in sanctuary, and I will say also, we say sanctuary churches. A mosque can be a sanctuary. A temple can be. I'm Hindu myself. A temple can be a sanctuary. A synagogue can be a sanctuary. We have a movement led by, I think, Pastor Paul Fleck in Connecticut. So he's leading the charge with other places of worship. So if you're part of a congregation that is interested in offering sanctuary, please, again, let us know, and we'll put you in contact with Paul Fleck, who is helping religious faith leaders through the process of what does it look like? What does our church to take this step to resist the deportations happening in our states?
There's a couple other things about it. So first of all, the term sanctuary, it has no solid legal basis. It's a powerful symbolic term, and in kind of material and practical terms, like has been said, it has extreme and very powerful benefits of sheltering people, families in places like churches or mosques or synagogues, etc. Again, emerging from the 1980s and the Cold War, attempts to protect refugees from the Central American wars coming here. So it has a powerful symbolic quality because it can bring communities together with a focus around protecting immigrants. Similarly, there are efforts to create sanctuary cities like Hartford, sanctuary towns. There's a number, New Haven, other towns in the state, Wyndham, that have declared through a political process to do, in a similar fashion, the efforts there are to acknowledge that the community is a welcoming place for immigrants, but also that will do various things, for example, making sure that the police doesn't collaborate in any kind of proactive way with immigration officials to allow them to come in. There is a memorandum of understanding, and maybe the lawyers could help me out, that has, through, I think, Department of Homeland Security or somewhere, about sensitive locations like churches and schools and hospitals that ICE agents aren't allowed to go in. And again, it's just a memorandum of understanding, so it's not really enforceable. And finally, there's also, from our experience at UConn, is creating a kind of, well, UConn has become a quasi-sanctuary campus. I don't know what's happened here at Central, but there's very explicit language drawing on the sanctuary movement, drawing on efforts in sanctuary towns to say that this campus, UConn, and again, this came from students pushing for this at UConn to make sure that the campus and campus police aren't collaborating with ICE officials, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, providing supports for undocumented students, whether it's if they lose their status through DACA, with extra scholarship opportunities, opportunities for education that would continue, et cetera, et cetera.
So I think this is very timely because I just shared with Dr. Nieves, there was a question from the audience about what is Capitol doing to protect immigrant students here at Capitol?
Thank you. One of the things, certainly, our system, the Connecticut State Colleges and University, as Mark referred to, we have indicated that individuals from ICE or other organizations are not allowed on campus. They would have to go through our system office, and before we would allow them on campus. We have our own police force on campus. We also do not release any information. Information that's given to us is confidential. But previously, I have signed on there's a group of college and university presidents which have signed on to support DACA students in every way possible. Our admissions office and others will not release any information in that. While unfortunately one of the things that we don't have is the financial resources to provide financial support and scholarships in that way, but we work with students through our counseling and our student services office to find the appropriate referrals so individuals are not jeopardized by their status or not even having the status to get the appropriate referral so that they know where they can go and get the assistance necessary. I am committed to finding every way possible to support the students and to make sure that our college is a place where individuals are respected and shown and given the appropriate dignity for who they are and what they want to accomplish.
Thank you, Dr. Diaz. So the last question that came from the group, I'll just take a quick pitch, and I think I'm very appreciative of everyone's time. I think we actually ended a little earlier than we had expected. We were maybe too ambitious in our conversation, but we cover a lot of ground, right? So the two questions were, and please feel free to chime in with other thoughts, but I figured they're connected. One question is, what can the state of Connecticut or the General Assembly more directly can do on behalf of the immigrant population, right? So there are several bills that will be coming into legislative session this year. Again, one is the Trust Act. And maybe, Varun, you want to talk about the Trust Act a little bit. But I'll talk briefly about the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status Bill. Our office, sort of leading a coalition of other immigrant rights organizations, is pursuing, again, legislation to protect kids between the ages of 18 to 21 who qualify for this particular visa called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. It's available to kids who have been abused, neglected, abandoned, and they can file for this visa. It's a very complex process. And that visa process allows them to remain here lawfully. Not everyone benefits from that visa, but the issue in Connecticut is that the federal law allows kids to apply for the benefit up to 21, but our state statutes do not allow people to go to court once they turn 18, because this is reserved to kids, for kids. There are 5 states in the nation that have enacted legislation to expand the protection for kids up to 21, 2 of them being our neighbors, Massachusetts and New York. If you live in any of those states, you can get the protection up to 21. And so Connecticut should be follow that model. So we're going to be pursuing that legislation. And then I know the Trust Act is probably going to be pursued in this year again. So I don't know if anyone wants to talk about the Trust Act.
Sure, and I'm going to reference a document so I don't misspeak. So the Trust Act was a law that was passed in 2013 to, again, limit collaboration between ICE and local law enforcement, because immigration is a federal issue. It's not the role of local law enforcement to be seeking out people to detain and deport them on the basis of their immigration status, right? The role of local law enforcement, in theory, and we can get into it, again, we can have a whole other conversation about like police and accountability and restorative justice, but I think that there's the role of local law enforcement is really to ensure the safety of a local community, right? And when local communities live in fear that their police officers are going to report them to ICE, that is actually, people are not going to report crimes, victims of crimes, witnesses to crimes. And so that actually makes our communities less safe. And so the Trust Act was, again, legislation that was passed in 2013. We've been trying to pass an updated version of the Trust Act for several years. Again, our state legislature, despite the fact that people claim that Connecticut's a sanctuary state, that we're a blue state, Democrats and Republicans have both failed to pass to update the Trust Act, along with other legislation that we've been fighting for years that would support immigrant communities in our state. So we're trying to close some loopholes with the Trust Act. So currently, there's loopholes that allow ICE to detain individuals without due process. So we're trying to change that because ICE often abuses their power. We want to, again, Connecticut officers can still communicate the release dates, immigration status, and other personal information to ICE. So we know ICE agents have been showing up at courthouses, at rehab facilities when people get released to immediately detain them. We know, so again, those are just some of the things we're trying to include in this new legislation, and generally increasing transparency and accountability. And so I hope that when come January, when the session begins, that you will join us in showing up to lobby with us, to go canvassing with us, to phone bank with us. It's going to take a lot of power for us to pass this legislation, and trust me, we've tried, and there will always be excuses. But we need to come together now more than ever to pass actual concrete laws and policies that make our immigrant community safer. And that will only happen due to organizing, right? So, and I'm biased because that's my job, but.
Thank you. So the last question was about legal aid organizations that people can connect for help. I think there's tons of organizations in the state. We want to increase that list ever so more. But I'll mention a few, and I think what we can do is we can figure out a way, if you provided your email, to send a list of agencies that people can connect to. But I'll start with where I work. It's called the Center for Children's Advocacy. We only represent youth up until the age of 21. There is in Hartford, Greater Hartford Legal Aid, New Haven Legal Assistance, Statewide Legal Services. The law schools have clinics. There's a clinic at Quinnipiac Law School where Denia, I think you work also at the clinic, right? Yukon Law School has also an asylum clinic. And there are two other organizations, the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants, CIRI, and they actually have an office here at 75 Main Street in Hartford. Building One Community in Stamford. And so I don't know if I'm missing any other that you would like for us to mention, but as I think Varun mentioned in the beginning, you should be following Connecticut Students for a Dream, you should be following Make the Road, because you get a lot of information from their grassroots organizing in terms of links to things that are happening. So I think that concludes our panel discussion. I just want to, again, thank our panelists and thank our audience for coming. And then, Camille, you want to, I'm sorry. I should have.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Hi, everybody. My name is Camille. I'm here with Connecticut Students for a Dream. I work with Varun and Mark and Noel. I just wanted to let everybody know, since we're talking about how we can stay involved, how we can be part of the movement, that we have meetings here in Hartford. We have them usually like once or twice a month. We have one coming up later this month to talk about the DREAM Act and to learn how we can be supportive of the efforts. So if you'd like to get involved in the movement, I'll be here afterwards. We can exchange contact info. Thank you.
Thank you, and I forgot to acknowledge Camille was here. But again, thank you.
I am so sorry. Like, just to give a brief background, I just came back from. We have a strong parent committee. They had like a very important and last-minute meeting with the superintendents of Bridgeport. So I'm like a little like flustered because I drove from Bridgeport. But one of the reasons why I'm here is because Make the Road is expanding to Hartford, and everybody has touched upon it. You know, people is power. And we want to be next to the Capitol. We want to be flooding the Capitol, having them hear our voices and see us. So we're looking for an organizer, we're looking for an office. We're going to probably collaborate with C4D now that we're in Hartford. So just check us out.
And they're awesome. So I think that's it. Varun, you want to say something else?
I just wanted to mention again that I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Connecticut Center for a New Economy as my employer. So they not only pay my bills, but they're an organization that fights for racial and economic justice in the state of Connecticut. So we were and including in part of our platform is immigrant rights. We want good jobs for working families here in Connecticut, regardless of immigration status. And so we've worked in New Haven, and folks, and I'll get this, we're in Hartford now, but if folks have heard of New Haven Rising, which is an effort that of the labor movement and the community that came together, and in large part of, CCNE, my organization, was driving a lot of that work to demand Yale University and Yale New Haven Hospital hire local workers in neighborhoods with the highest rates of poverty and unemployment. And here in Hartford, again, we're working right now on a campaign. We specifically want more Black and Latino teachers. We want more opportunities for current Hartford residents to become, go to college, become certified to teach and work in our schools. Because we know in Hartford, majority of our teachers, or about 80% of our teachers are white and don't live in the city. And we know that that number is, the statistic is increasingly, it's on the decline. The number of Black and Latino teachers in Hartford is on decline. So I don't want to, again, I'm not trying to steal the show. I just wanted to mention that as an issue that is something that really, and does affect our local communities, having job opportunities for Hartford residents, having an educational system that, reclaiming and rethinking our schools is in the city of Hartford, which is really what we're trying to do. Would really benefit immigrants in our schools, among other all marginalized groups in our schools. There's a lot of work to be done, so I just wanted to mention that. If folks are interested in touching base with me about that specific work, I would love to follow up with you about it.
So I think what we'll also do is we'll include contact information for all of our panelists in terms of places where they are, that you can contact them and the work that they're doing. Okay. Thank you all.